Political commentator Peter Spencer joins us this morning. Top of the morning, Peter. So is this newfound obsession with maths simply a dead cat, a classic distraction tactic from the NHS and the ongoing train strikes?
Well, I personally find it pretty scary. I'd take my boots off to count past 3, and indeed, in additional mathematics, personally, I achieved no more than 3%, which I'm told is not all that much. But most certainly, to pick up your point about the dead cat, it does rather feel as though he is actually ignoring not just the elephant in the room, but indeed the herd of elephants in the room, which is the NHS. And when you look at a situation where you've got hundreds of people dying, we are told, each week for lack of emergency care, you've also got opinion polls suggesting that 80% of us thereabouts actually think the government is handling the NHS crisis badly, and only 10% think that they're doing okay. Then you think, well, hello, which planet are you on? If you,
I mean, is that fair, Peter? I mean,
no.
A lot of politicians get criticised, don't they, for only focusing and lurching from crisis to crisis. And we understand that the Prime Minister is personally chairing meetings every day to look at the situation with the NHS. And he's hugely going under the bonnet, I think, is the phrase that's in all of the papers this morning. But he's trying to also, in this huge speech, and a lot of people have been questioning where he's been hiding. Well, we're going to hear a little bit about what his vision is for the future. And, it's admirable, isn't it, if he's trying to raise education standards?
Oh yes, I mean, it feels like he's reprising Tony Blair's education mantra, which I have to say was delivered in earlier and happier times. But most certainly, of course, the government does need to have vision on all sorts of things. And I take your point about how he does appear to be the invisible Prime Minister, which I think is probably unfair because he's a guy that just gets on with his work. He needs to put himself on the front foot, of course. I note also that he isn't, in fact, planning for any of this stuff to happen until the next Parliament. So it's a little bit, at the moment, rather for the birds. There is that immediate crisis facing, I come back to it, on the NHS. And what actually does surprise me is that he hasn't chosen to make his big announcement, I'm going to have a root and branch look at the NHS and really big that up, because for God's sake, there is a huge problem there.
Well, Peter, maths is actually the world's most hated subject. 25% of pupils can't stand it. I think I'm one of them. I suspect this might be...
25%, how much is that?
I think it's about a third. The thing is, I think compulsory maths will be about as popular as compulsory broccoli. But here's one thing that the critics are saying, and I think they've got a point. 45% of British schools don't even have a full-time maths teacher. It's a teacher who is doubling up. So it's one thing to say we must have a gold standard service, but the numbers don't add up. The teachers aren't there.
Well, that is the point, of course, that the Labour opposition is making, is that it's an empty promise unless you actually recruit huge numbers more teachers. And this sort of stuff doesn't happen overnight. But I come back to the run-up time to this. This is not likely to happen until the next Parliament, so they've got a little bit more time. But I suspect that it would take a bit more than just 18 months or so to get the numbers of maths teachers up to the necessary levels to actually translate this, what at present is a mantra or a slogan or a speech, into a reality in the classroom.
Interesting, this distraction allegation, also suggestions he's trying to beat Sir Keir Starmer to it, who's expected to deliver a keynote speech as well about how better we could govern. I think that's tomorrow, isn't it? But what do you make of the government's current argument that actually they're satisfied the NHS is sufficiently funded, and actually the current crisis is this triple whammy of strep A and increased anxiety around it, and then the twin-demic as well?
All these things are true, of course, but what they are, to my mind, what they are is the tip of the iceberg. I come back to a report that was issued at the behest of the government a little while back by the King's Fund, in which there's a think tank, in which it claimed that there was a decade of neglect, which is the cause of the NHS's hideous problems. And it doesn't take any working out at all. People are living longer. And as they get older, so they become more frail and they need more attention. I mean, you know, during my childhood, which, just in case you were wondering, does actually post-date the Norman invasion, the life expectancy, I thought I mentioned that in passing, yeah. Life expectancy was... That's enough from you, madam. Life expectancy... Not to be serious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, life expectancy was 67. So basically, guys would hang up their boots one year, and then a couple of years later, they were pushing up the daisies, and that completely sort of transformed the situation. When you think that, you know, if they are pushing up the daisies, they're not pushing up the cost of healthcare. Well, now that they're living 20 years longer, of course, I mean, it's also a problem for the pensions, it has to be said. And so, of course, there is however much money the government says it's flinging at this problem, it is manifestly not enough. The point that the King's Fund made was that we currently have not enough staff, not enough equipment, and not enough up-to-date buildings. Well, that's a pretty damning recipe, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, Peter Spence, that was an entertaining summary of the politics of the day. Perhaps, you know, a little bit of light, I suppose, in all of the misery that we've been talking about recently. Who thought maths would be bringing a smile to all of our faces this morning? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. You said all me.
Well, that too.